There's been a lot of research already that suggests that these concerns about immigration may have to do with how they construct national identity. So the notion of what does it mean to be American, and so there's a lot of work that has looked at how to be American it means being white, and Divos and Banaji has done a series of studies that have looked at that. Some of my work with Glenn and my collaborator Ludwin, we've looked at how participants who define American identity in a specific way, that is, those who endorse this idea that to be truly American, you must assimilate to this dominant construction of identity, those participants were the ones that tended to have an ethnocentric bias in law enforcement. So meaning, in one of the studies, what we had done was we just asked people's attitudes towards different tenets of the Arizona law. Some of those focused on punishing undocumented immigrants, and some of those focused on punishing US employers who exploit undocumented immigrants. And what we found was that people who endorse this idea of that to be American you must assimilate, those were the folks who supported the punishment of the immigrants, but not so much the employers who exploited them or who employed them. So getting at the idea that it's not necessarily they were against undocumented immigration per se, but it was more about tough treatment of immigrants. And so a follow-up of that work, we examined whether, how is this identity related to, punishment of immigrants based on national origin and documentation status. So what we found there was that the same, we have white US citizens, those who did endorse this assimilation is construction of identity, they supported the punishment of Mexican immigrants compared to Canadian immigrants, even when the Mexican immigrant had a documentation status. So getting at the idea that it was not really this concern for rule of law, which was neutral, but really more getting at ethnocentric concerns. So this is this line of work that we're doing that gets at this question about how much of this tough immigration legislation really gets at this defense of privileged identities versus this neutral enforcement of law. So the present work that I'm talking to you about today gets at the same question, but we instead of looking at participants' endorsement of that construction of identity, we were interested in looking at how they respond to targets as a function of whether the targets assimilate or not, and of course the national origin as well. And so we were interested in how that influences particularly their judgment of suspicion, meaning how likely they think they're suspicious of being an undocumented immigrant, as well as how they evaluate tough treatment of these targets. So the design for both studies are the same, so I'm going to pretty much present them together, as well as when I talk about the results. So in both studies, these were all American citizens who identified as white Caucasians. And we collected this from Amazon Mechanical Turk in the hope of getting a wider array of age. And in terms of gender, we only asked if they were male or female, so this reflects kind of a dichotomous reflection. Okay, so what we had participants do was they all read a transcript, a fake transcript, of a traffic stop where an officer stops the driver and the 3 passengers in a car for driving 6 miles over the speed limit, and then subsequently detains them and takes them to the police station. And we manipulated 2 factors. So we manipulated national origin and identity fit to examine how that impacts their attitudes towards the target. So in our first study, we had Mexican targets versus Canadian targets. And in the second study, we had Mexican targets versus Irish targets. One of the reasons we had Irish in the second was mostly to get at, okay, this is an immigrant group, but it's not necessarily a recent immigrant group. And it was an immigrant group that did have a lot of hostile attitudes towards them when they first immigrated to the United States. And then, most importantly, in this study, we, as I said earlier, we manipulated assimilation, and we did that by looking at what we call fit, like high versus low fit to this dominant identity. And we did that by looking, and I'll give you more details as I proceed, but looking at the kind of music the kind of music that the police officer heard that was coming from the car, what sport they had just come from visiting, and the accent. So in this case, the important thing to remember is all the targets did speak English. We just manipulated their accent. Okay. So just some general questions. We obviously want to examine whether, does assimilation matter? So we predict that, people who assimilate may be seen as less suspicious, and tough treatment might be seen as more inappropriate. Origin matters based on our previous study, and just based on a lot of research in general. We suspect that, the Mexican targets would receive the most negative treatment. And then most importantly, we were really interested in examining whether, this benefit of assimilation, is that really afforded equally to Mexican versus the Canadian and Irish targets. So I'll just give you a sense this is going to be a lot of text, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how we were manipulating this transcript. And one thing I will say is that we actually didn't present the entire transcript as a whole thing. So we had it at different time points. So at the end of each time point, so this is like time point 1, participants are indicating to what extent do you think the occupants, at least one of the occupants in the car, is likely to be an undocumented immigrant. And then, the officer does something. So in the first time point is at the end when he stops them. So how appropriate is it that the officer stop them for driving 6 miles over the hour? So each time point, we ask them how suspicious you think they are of being an undocumented immigrant, and whatever is the relevant action that the officer does, we ask them to indicate their level of appropriateness of that treatment. So in the first time point, this is just giving the introduction. You see that the officer is just sitting in a neighborhood, and he observes a car, and the stuff in the blue is what basically we manipulated. And so we manipulated origin by just literally saying that the car had a large bumper sticker displaying a Mexican, Irish, or Canadian flag. It's only at the very end they actually know that they are from these places. But at this moment, it's really just the flag that's manipulating it. Who are singing along in Spanish, English, or French to Mexican ranchera, Irish folk, French rock music. So here there is language at a play. It was a lot of fun trying to think about what are the different types of music. And so this is all they see, and then they indicate suspicion and appropriateness relevance. Now, the second time point, it gets a little bit more detailed. Here's where the officer is saying that they're approaching this person. And here's where you start seeing the officer interacting with the driver. In this case, the driver is male all the time. And so the officer, asked them to turn down the music, and that's when you again read about that, what is the music that they were playing, and they talk about why they stopped, and that's where you read about the accent, and then you have the name, which is suggesting origin or fit. Okay. And then at the third time point, so at the second time point, they asked for the license, and the driver gave him the license. At the third time point, the officer says, "Can I see your vehicle registration?" And then he gives it to the officer, but then the officer finds that it's been expired, but it was expired 2 weeks ago. And so the driver talks about, well, I just, I didn't know that my registration expired. I just moved home, so I didn't really get the notice. So these are all like instances where things are a little ambiguous. Yes, technically it's against the law, but it just expired 2 weeks ago and they just moved. And so there are all these things where, the officer could just let them go. At the fourth time point is the only thing we say is they're either coming from a soccer or a baseball game. Can anyone guess which is the high fit? So baseball was the high fit, and soccer was the low assimilation. And then finally, at the time point 5 is basically when they read about the fact that the officer actually took the license and the registration, goes and calls for backup. in the meanwhile asks all the people to get out of the car and has them sit on the sidewalk on the ground, and then handcuffs them when the other officers come, and then takes them to the police station. And then at the end, again, they indicate their suspicion judgments, and then we just gave them a final paragraph to say that they were all taken to the police station. So in other words, you start off with kind of like a traffic violation, which is a little ambiguous, but it quickly develops into an immigration situation. So, like I said, at the end of each time point, participants indicated on a scale of 1 to 7. So all of these items are on a scale of 1 to 7. How much suspicion there is, and this phrase, reasonable suspicion, was something that was used a lot in Arizona type laws. So how much of that there is that at least some of the occupants were unlawful residents of the U.S. And the second question that they're also doing right after, at the end of each time point, is indicating the appropriateness of the officer actions. So 4 of these were related to traffic violations, and they took place in the first few interactions. And then, as you see later on, they become related to more immigration violations, where the officer specifically handcuffs them because they think that they might not be a documented immigrant or a citizen. And then finally, for study 2 only, we also asked participants to just simple on a scale of 1 to 7, and there are 4 people, just rate each occupant in the car to what extent do you think they're truly American. So high scores mean that we think these people are more American. Okay. So for study 1, where we had Mexican versus Canadian, we find main effects of national origin and national identity fits. So basically, participants thought that if you're Mexican, you're more suspicious, and compared to if you're Canadian. And then regardless of national origin, if you assimilate, you are seen as less suspicious than compared to if you are not. We were also interested in just looking at, even though there was no interaction, just to look at some of the simple effects. So we conducted these post hoc simple effects for all of these analyses, correcting for Tukey. And the one thing I will also note is in all analysis, we did control for political ideology, because that's consistently been a very strong predictor of immigration-related attitudes. Okay, so when we did do that post hoc test, what we found was that, yes, there's an effect of origin, there's an effect of fit, but not assimilating seems to be especially bad for the Mexican targets. They're the ones who get dinged the most compared to the Canadian target, and this is exactly pretty much the same thing that you get in study 2 when you compare the Mexican with the Irish. So in general, assimilating makes you less suspicious, and Mexicans are seen as more suspicious. Mexicans who don't assimilate are especially seen as more suspicious compared to, say, the Irish or the Canadians who do not assimilate. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like over the course of time, so the green colors are basically reflecting the low-fit people, so in both study 1 and study 2. So these are people who don't assimilate. Purple is reflecting the people who do assimilate. The solid lines are reflecting the Mexican targets in both studies, and the dotted lines are reflecting Canadians in the first study and Irish in the second study. So this is just to give you a sense that, especially in study 2, you see that really it's the low-fit Mexican target that's consistently on top in terms of levels of suspicion right from the very first interaction. And this first interaction was literally just some music playing from the car and the bumper sticker. And then you see that, for everyone, obviously when they find that there's no sort of registration and there's no passport to indicate your citizenship, that's when everybody kind of is seen as more suspicious. In the first study, you find that, you start with the low-fit Canadian actually as not as suspicious, in the sense they are similar to the high-fit Mexican, which is also interesting. But they do, as, the interaction progresses, their levels of suspicion also tends to increase. And one thing that I will notice through the interactions, accent was more or less consistently manipulated. Okay, so moving on, so just to remind you, we had two sets of appropriateness measures, so ones which were related to traffic violations, ones related to immigration violations. So when it comes to traffic violations, we find that there's actually a main effect of national origin, and really not much, there's a marginal effect of identity fit. In this case, really what's going on, and you can see from the bars, it's really the high fit Canadian for whom the participants think that, come on, stopping just because it's 6 miles over, that's ridiculous, or, just questioning them, stopping them, because, giving them a citation because their registration expired. So they really think those are not as appropriate compared to the Mexican target. So really what this data is suggesting, at least this particular graph, is that for Mexicans, even if they assimilate or not, people generally consider tough treatment of them, even when it comes to simple traffic violations, as pretty much more appropriate, and compared to Canadians, where maybe the ones who assimilate tend to get some better treatment. For immigration violations, national origin did not play a fit. So here, straight up, it was strongly identity fit. So people who assimilate, so it's whether it's Mexicans or Canadians, those who assimilate, for them, people are like, okay, it's not okay. These, you cannot just handcuff them and have them sit on the ground, compared to people who don't assimilate. Similarly, for study 2, well, not similarly actually, because it was a different pattern. Here, actually, we find that it's kind of a different way of thinking about it. So in the first study, it was like, even if Mexicans assimilate, it doesn't really matter. In this case, we're finding that the flip in that for Irish, it doesn't matter whether they assimilate or not. So kind of like a privilege effect. Regardless of whether they assimilate, people may think that it's not okay. But in this case, at least, compared to the Irish participants, we find that for Mexicans, assimilation does matter. So it seems like sometimes assimilation does lead to some benefits, but sometimes it doesn't really lead to any benefits when it comes to Mexican targets. And then, consistent with what we found with the previous study, when it comes to immigration violations, really it was about fit, and origin didn't really play a role at all. So when it comes to immigration violations, it's about how much you assimilate. And here I just want to quickly note that, while on one level we might think that this is really positive in this to some extent, but that origin doesn't really matter when it comes to how you think about treatment for people who potentially violate immigration law. The way we had the transcript kind of suggests that, well, to get to that immigration question, you have to get stopped first for something that seems very small, like a traffic violation. So even though origin may not matter later on, by then you've already stopped those people, and people may start thinking about, okay, you're Mexican, so you might get more harassed because you play Mexican ranchera music. And then finally, this was only for study 2. If you remember, we just asked straight up, to what extent are these people American? And high scores means they're seen as more American. And here we again find that assimilation does not matter. So if you're Irish, or if the target was Irish, participants thought the ones who assimilated were more American than those who didn't. But for the Mexicans, even if they did assimilate, they were still not seen as any more American. So here they were not afforded any benefits of American. So in conclusion, when it comes to suspicion judgments, participants consider the Mexican targets as more suspicious compared to the Canadian and Irish. This was especially the case when Mexican targets did not assimilate. When they did assimilate, though, they were not seen as suspicious. When it came to traffic violations, it was a little bit more nuanced in that assimilation did benefit Canadians. It didn't matter so much for Irish and Mexicans, but in different ways. So in study 1, we found that regardless of whether they assimilate or not, this tough treatment for these seemingly small traffic violations was seen as appropriate. And for Irish, it was the other way, in the sense that this tough treatment was seen as inappropriate regardless of whether they assimilated or not. When it came to immigration violations, however, it was pretty consistent that assimilation was generally beneficial for all targets, and the biggest difference really happened between the low-fit and the high-fit Mexicans. So, in conclusion, I mean, one of the things this data may suggest is that Mexican targets may feel a greater pressure to assimilate, since assimilation does seem to have some maybe benefits for them, especially when it gets at immigration relevant attitudes or effects. So, in terms of being seen as whether you are, likely to be an undocumented immigrant or not, or like being punished or scrutinized for immigration violations. Comparatively, the Irish Canadian targets may not feel the pressure as much, as there may not be that many costs. However, that being said, so that concern is actually quite reflective of something that has been predominant in the US for a while. So on the right is the picture of a newspaper from the early 1900s, and this is actually taken from the Ellis Island Immigration Museum, which talks about how this emphasis on assimilation has been there from a long time ago, even when the early immigrants came, which is why I brought up Irish immigrants. And on the left is Trump's response to actually another Republican candidate, Jeb Bush, who was asked a question in Spanish, and he responded to that question in Spanish. And Trump thought that, well, that's not okay. In this country, you have to speak English, you have to assimilate. So this notion of that you have to assimilate is something that it's not just this data, but I mean there's a lot of cultural artifacts that promote or suggest that that's the way to be. But again, I will note that, in both these cases, there's all this emphasis on language, but everyone here did speak English. So assimilation here was a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more subtle. And at the end of the day, what we find is that, even for the Mexican targets who did assimilate, while they may receive some covert, more of the, I always get confused between covert and overt. More of the, is covert the one that's more obvious? Yes. Okay, the other way around, yes. Overt benefits, like, maybe if you assimilate, maybe you won't be seen as much suspicious. People are not going to be like, are you an undocumented immigrant? But they don't seem to be receiving the covert benefits in the sense that they're still not seen as really American, and people don't consider them truly American regardless of how much they assimilate. So they can speak the language, they can speak with an American accent, they can listen to American rock music, and they can play baseball or watch baseball and do all these little things, but at least this data suggests that they're still not seen as American. So going back to this, I mean, you see all of these things, but obviously there's just more to that because it's not just about language, and it's not just simply about assimilation. Origin does seem to play a role. Specifically in this case, it seems to be that origin is racialized, and that's what maybe is playing a bigger role than just straight up assimilate and it'll all be okay, which seems to be, like I said, predominant in a lot of the discourse in the US. And so with that, I just want to thank all of you. I want to thank Glenn and Ludwin from KU, and also KU for University of Kansas for supporting this research by providing money. And I look forward to any questions or feedback that you may have.